I never believed in ghosts. I'd always been the type to scoff at local legends, dismissing them as nothing more than stories meant to scare kids around campfires. But that night at the old Victorian manor on the outskirts of town, something happened that I still can't explain. It all started when my friends, Jake, Sarah, and David, and I decided to test our courage by visiting the infamous manor. The place had been abandoned for decades, and the stories that circulated around town were filled with dark tales of a family meeting a violent end within its walls. They said their souls were trapped there, doomed to haunt the manor for eternity. It was a cool autumn evening, the kind where the chill in the air seeps into your bones. As we drove toward the house, I could see it looming in the distance, its crumbling facade barely visible through the thick veil of fog. The once grand structure was now a decaying ruin, overtaken by nature. Dead ivy snaked up the sides of the house, and the windows were dark, like the hollow eyes of a skull. Jake parked the car at the end of the driveway, and we all got out, the crunch of dead leaves beneath our feet breaking the silence. Sarah was the first to hesitate, her eyes locked on the towering iron gate in front of us. "You guys sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David laughed nervously. "Come on, Sarah. It's just an old house. Nothing's gonna happen." I didn't respond. My gaze was fixed on the manor. Even from the outside, it felt wrong. Like the air around it was thicker, harder to breathe. I shook off the feeling and took a step forward, reaching out to touch the rusted gate. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and as I pushed it open, it let out a long, groaning creak, as if the house itself was protesting our presence. We walked down the overgrown path, the wind picking up and whipping through the skeletal trees that lined the property. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I pressed on, not wanting to be the first to back out. When we reached the front door, I hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open. It swung inward with little resistance, revealing a dark, musty foyer. The smell of decay hit me immediately, like the house had been rotting from the inside out for years. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet as we stepped inside, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Sarah was the first to speak. "This place is giving me the creeps," she said, her voice shaky. Jake, always the brave one, chuckled. "It's just an old house. You're letting the stories get to you." But as we moved deeper into the manor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched. We entered what must have once been the grand ballroom, and the sight of it took my breath away. The room was vast, the ceiling soaring high above us, but everything was in ruins. The remains of a chandelier dangled precariously from the ceiling, its crystals casting faint, distorted reflections on the walls. Then Sarah froze. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I strained to listen. At first I didn't hear anything, but then, faintly, there was a low, humming sound. It was barely audible, but it was there, coming from the far corner of the room. Sarah moved toward it, and the rest of us followed, curiosity overtaking our fear. As we got closer, the humming grew louder. It wasn't melodic, though. It was unsettling. And then it changed. The humming morphed into a low growl, deep and guttural, like something primal, something angry. Sarah backed away, her face pale. "We need to leave," she said, panic rising in her voice. Before any of us could respond, the ballroom door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the house and we all jumped, hearts racing. The temperature in the room plummeted, our breaths visible in the cold air. I could feel it now. Something was in here with us. Jake rushed to the door, pounding on it with his fists. "Let us out!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But the door wouldn't budge. We were trapped. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the others breathing heavily, panic setting in. The growling grew louder, seeming to come from all around us like the walls themselves were alive. And then the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was a figure. At first I couldn't make out any details. It was just a dark silhouette. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it clearly. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque, too-wide grin. It stood there, motionless, staring at us with those glowing eyes, its grin growing wider with each passing second. We didn't wait to find out what it wanted. We ran. I don't know how we made it out of that house, but we did. We sprinted through the front door, down the path, and into the car, not stopping until we were miles away from the manor. We never spoke of it again, but every night since I've been haunted by that grin, by those eyes. I know what we saw wasn't human, and whatever it was, it's still in that house, waiting. The heat was unbearable, even as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon. I had been driving for hours, the desert stretching endlessly around me, nothing but the occasional tumbleweed breaking the monotony of sand and scrub. I was on a stretch of highway in the Nevada desert that locals avoided. Stories of strange occurrences and ghostly encounters haunted its reputation. But I had no choice. I needed to reach the next town before night fully set in. The air in the car was stifling, thick with the scent of sweat and old upholstery. I flicked the AC to max, but it barely made a difference. That's when I saw her, a figure on the side of the road, standing motionless. A young woman, dressed in a flowing white dress, her arm raised in a gesture for help. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers. It's a rule I've lived by for years. But something about her, I don't know, maybe it was the way she stood there, as if she had nowhere else to go. Or maybe it was the eerie stillness in the air, a silence so thick it seemed to push me toward her. Before I knew it, my foot was on the brake, the car rolling to a stop just a few feet from where she stood. She stepped forward, her face partially obscured by the setting sun, but I could see enough, dark hair cascading down her back, pale skin, and eyes that seemed too bright, too intense for the fading light. I lowered the window, the hum of the engine suddenly too loud in the quiet desert. "Where you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My throat was dry, the heat clinging to me even as the sun disappeared. "Just to the next town," she replied, her voice soft, almost melodic. "Can you give me a lift?" I hesitated. There was something off about her, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But I couldn't just leave her out here, could I? The nearest town was at least an hour away, and no one else was going to come by. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Sure, hop in." She slid into the passenger seat, her dress brushing against the worn leather with a soft whisper, the sound louder than it should have been in the confined space. I glanced over at her, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. Her eyes. There was something wrong with her eyes. They glinted unnaturally in the dim light, like they were reflecting something I couldn't see. I pulled back onto the road, the tires kicking up dust as we drove into the gathering night. Silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable. I tried to make conversation, asking her what she was doing out here alone, but her answers were vague, evasive. She spoke in short bursts, her gaze fixed out the window, her fingers absent-mindedly trailing along the edge of her dress. Every time she spoke, her voice seemed to fade, as if she were growing more distant. The longer we drove, the more unsettled I became. Something wasn't right. I checked the clock on the dashboard. An hour had passed. We should have seen the town by now, but the road ahead remained pitch black, the desert stretching endlessly into the void. I glanced at her, heart pounding. "We should have hit the next town by now," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" She turned to me slowly, her lips curling into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. "We're not far now," she whispered, her words barely audible over the hum of the engine. I wanted to believe her, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to turn the car around, to leave her on the side of the road and never look back. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I fought the rising panic. Then, without warning, the temperature dropped. The stifling heat of the desert was replaced by an icy chill that seeped into my bones. The windows fogged up, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I shot a glance at the passenger seat, my stomach twisting in knots. She was gone. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt, tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I threw open the door and stumbled out, the cold desert air biting at my skin. There was no trace of her, no footprints in the dust, no lingering presence, just the vast, empty expanse of the desert, stretching out in all directions under the pale glow of the moon. I stood there, for what felt like hours, listening to the deafening silence, the wind whipping around me, carrying with it a faint whisper, her voice. "We're not far now." I jumped back into the car, slamming the door behind me, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. I floored the gas, speeding down the highway, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. But no matter how fast I drove, the road seemed endless, stretching on and on into the night. I never saw the town. When the sun rose, I found myself back where I started. The same stretch of highway, the same barren landscape. The only difference was the memory, the haunting image of that woman in white, her cold eyes watching me from the shadows, her voice still echoing in my ears. I never drove that road again, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear her, whispering just out of reach. "We're not far now." The grand old hotel perched on the cliff was a relic of a bygone era, its opulence now marred by time and neglect. My girlfriend and I had been driving for hours, the storm outside relentless. We sought refuge, not realizing we were about to step into a nightmare. The wind howled as we pulled up to the hotel, its dark silhouette looming ominously against the stormy sky. Waves crashed violently against the rocks below, the rhythmic pounding almost hypnotic. The hotel's grandeur was evident even through the rain-smeared windows, but its beauty was overshadowed by an unsettling aura. We entered the lobby, the silence inside a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The concierge, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, handed us the key with a grave expression. His words about not wandering the halls at night were cryptic, almost as if he were warning us of something far worse than mere superstition. We laughed it off, brushing aside his warnings with a wave of our hands. Our room was located on the 5th floor, the elevator ride accompanied by eerie creaks and groans. The hallways were dimly lit, each step echoing through the vast emptiness. We reached our room and, despite the oppressive atmosphere, felt a sense of relief. The antique furniture and the large, inviting bed promised a warm sanctuary from the storm. As the wind howled louder and the rain beat against the windows with a frenzied rhythm, we settled into bed. Just as I began to drift off, a soft, mournful cry pierced through the cacophony of the storm. At first it seemed like a trick of the wind, but the sound grew clearer with each passing moment. a child's anguished cry. "Did you hear that?" my girlfriend whispered, her voice trembling. Her hand clutched mine tightly, as if trying to anchor herself against the encroaching fear. "It's just the wind," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though my own heart raced. The cry came again, unmistakable now, filled with a profound sadness that seemed to cut through the storm. We cautiously got out of bed, the coldness of the room a stark contrast to the warmth of the covers. The temperature dropped rapidly, our breath forming visible clouds in the icy air. Each step toward the sound was a struggle, the chill sinking into our bones. In the corner of the room, a small, translucent figure appeared. The boy's form shimmered like a mirage, his face streaked with tears, eyes full of a sorrow that seemed to seep into the very walls of the room. He reached out, his tiny hands stretching toward us in a gesture of desperation. My girlfriend gasped, her eyes wide with terror. We stumbled backward, our hearts pounding in our chests. The boy's presence was overwhelming, his sadness so palpable it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. When the ghostly figure reached out, his icy fingers brushed against my arm. The touch was colder than anything I had ever felt, sending a jolt of pure fear through me. We screamed in unison, scrambling back to the bed, pulling the covers over our heads. The boy's mournful cries grew fainter, but the chill remained, permeating every corner of the room. As dawn approached, the storm subsided, and the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. The boy's figure vanished with the first light of day. The warmth slowly returned to the room, but the memory of that night lingered like a cold shadow. We fled the hotel as soon as the sun was up, our hearts still racing with the fear of what we had witnessed. The ghostly boy and his haunting cries were etched into our minds, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lay hidden beneath the hotel's majestic facade. We vowed never to return, the echoes of that stormy night forever haunting us.